studios and so forth. So I guess the question I'm building up to here is, as someone who was sort of a contract director, what made his work, his body of work, worthwhile? And you thought it was worth writing a book about him as opposed to some Alfred Hitchcock who generated his own project.
Well, there's already a lot of books about Hitchcock, but there really isn't much about Honda at all. And that's one of the primary reasons. Well, I think this, or yeah, because I mean we both have many thoughts about this. I was talking to someone recently, and somebody described Honda as a journeyman who captured the zeitgeist. I don't like the word zeitgeist. I'm sick and tired of it, and I'm sure we all are. But he captured the zeitgeist over and over and over again through his films. Never more so than in Godzilla. But I think that that's why. Yes, he was a company man, a studio man, but his films always seem to. This is a film that's set in 1954 Japan. It's very much about the experiences of people who lived through the war and through the aftermath of the war, and it's nevertheless, very resonant today with what's going on in our world now. We're living in a time when our president is normalizing the threat of nuclear war. So the warning that Takashi Shimura's character issues at the end of the film is something that we haven't heeded, and it's still something that's very urgent today. But the film, that's one of the things that I find so remarkable about this film. This is actually one of 3 films that was made between about 1952 and 1954. In the book we call them essentially a de facto trilogy of films about the atomic bomb that were made after the end of the occupation, and the censorship on those themes was lifted. There were 2 films that were sponsored by the Japan Teachers Union in an effort to educate the public about the atomic bomb and the effects of it. One was called Children of Hiroshima, sometimes called Children of the Atom Bomb. The second one, actually, after that film was done, the Teachers Union felt that it was too much of an art film. There's actually renditions of people being caught in the atomic explosion of Hiroshima, and it's rendered rather artfully. So they commissioned a second film called Hiroshima, and some of the imagery in that film is very similar to what we see in this film. And incidentally, all 3 of the films have a score by Akira Ifukube. So there's sort of this thematic or musical thematic link between the 3 of them. But the scenes in the burn ward, or the triage unit, where everyone is writhing in pain and there's people lying on the floor and they're burned, there's almost the exact same scene as that in Hiroshima. So these images were still very present in the public consciousness. So that's why I say it was a film that was very much of its time, and yet it still has things to teach us today that are very powerful. And then another reason why I think this film continues to resonate is it's a human story. A lot of these films, are very much, and this one is too, very much about the spectacle of the destruction. But it's also got at its core a heart. Serizawa's kind of the heart of the film, because he's someone who is suffering essentially through a global trauma and a personal trauma, and that makes the film relatable on a personal level. And never did Honda, maybe weigh in with that theme to that degree ever again, because of a lot of different reasons that we go into in the book, business reasons. But that film pops up again and again in powerful and still resonant ways. And again, we'll see it tonight in The H-Man, and expressed in an entirely different way.
So maybe, Ed, if I could bring you into the conversation here, would you have something you'd like to say about Honda's contribution to this film? I mean, knowing from what I've read and from some of the supplementals on the DVDs and things you put out, the original storyline seems like it was more almost of an anime fantasy. We had like a mad scientist with a cape running around. This is not a fantasy. It's kind of really depressing. And I think maybe that post-war feeling was something that Honda brought to it. Is that fair assessment? Making it not a fantasy film, making it... As my favorite line in the film is, ladies and gentlemen, this is not a movie or TV show, this is reality. I think that's what makes this movie what it is.
Well, again, Honda was very keen on documentary style, and I think you see that very clearly in this film, that he's bringing very grounded and matter-of-fact style to the film, something that, again, you can, it puts the audience in a situation they can very clearly relate to what these characters are thinking. Honda's one of his missions directions was to take a concept, no matter how fantastic it was, and show how people would react to that if this was actually something that was happening. And very, very well accomplished in that field.
Yeah, I don't think his goal in life was to be a science fiction director. But my understanding is, there's an interview somewhere where he says, Toho didn't divide their directors into Godzilla directors and non-Godzilla directors. There was science fiction and non-science fiction. So obviously, he went on from this to do a lot of science fiction films, including Godzilla films. But what did he really want to do with this? I read it in your book somewhere, or one of your articles. His real goal was to be more domestic dramas, right?
He did a lot of those. The period between roughly around the time this film was made and, say, 1960, that was an extremely prolific period for him. And for the Japanese movie business, it was booming, and so directors like him who could make these commercial films were in high demand. But he was making drama films, comedies, war films. He made a number of what were called song films, Kaio Eiga, which starred some of the popular pop songstresses of the time, and those were quite popular, and they weren't out-and-out musicals, but people would break into song. So he was quite adept at, and that's something that he sort of took from his mentor. Ajiro Yamamoto was one of the great commercial filmmakers of the 30s and 40s. Yamamoto also dabbled, or you want to call that, in many, many different genres, and Honda kind of took a cue from that, and he enjoyed experimenting. And as time went on, you'd see Honda kind of taking these different genres and making hybrids out of them. The film we're going to see tonight is a great example of that. It's got horror, sci-fi, film noir. So he was quite adept at a lot of things, and he enjoyed experimenting. But yes, there were times as his career progressed when he felt boxed in, and that boxing in was not. It was a result of the commercial constraints of the industry. The popularity of his films, both at home and abroad, made him very valuable as a maker of these films. And then, concurrent to that, the industry kind of started to narrow its focus. Toho started to narrow its focus on these bigger budget, commercial, blockbuster, if you will, films, as opposed to the more personal kind of films that he really enjoyed making.
And producer Tomoyuki Tanaka, as we quote in the book, he said he felt that Honda could have been a director who would have been on the stature of somebody like Naruse. But because of his decision, Tanaka's decision, Honda was making very successful commercial films, and he was the one that felt he was responsible for channeling Honda in that direction almost exclusively, probably to the detriment of his overall career and some of his wishes as the kind of films he would like to make.
A couple of Honda's films from the second half of the 50s are what I've called Narusian a little bit. If you've seen any of Mikio Naruse's films, the quote that from Tanaka, producer Tanaka, that Ed is referencing was, I guess I have to paraphrase it, but it's something like, if I hadn't pushed Honda in the direction of science fiction films, he would have become a director more like Mikio Naruse. And Naruse was a specialist in dramas and melodramas about, basically about women in post-war Japan, and it really focused a lot on their romantic hardships, their financial hardships. And there are a couple of films that Honda made in the immediate post-Godzilla period that really mirror a lot of the same themes. They're not done in quite the same way. Naruse films tend to be quite downbeat, and Honda was not necessarily a downbeat kind of guy, but there are some real strong parallels between the two.
Since we're speaking to a Cinematech audience and not a sci-fi geek audience, hopefully. What are a couple of his non-genre films, Ed, that you would recommend? It's like somebody's seen this and said, okay, yeah, I love the giant monster, but there's this really grim, dramatic tone in the character scenes. Like, are there other films out there that people could get into and say, okay, well, it's not that monster, but...
Well, unfortunately, none of his non-science fiction films are available in any format that can be seen by Western audiences, but we were fortunate in the course of our research on project to be able to see all of his films except one. And a couple of them in particular stand out. I think the war film Farewell Raval is a very interesting film, which Honda takes a very clear aim at the Japanese government's attitude towards its people during World War II and how little that the Japanese valued life, and that was what he postulates is one of the reasons that they lost the war, because of the very harsh attitude that they took towards human life, not even valuing their own people's lives. And on the other side of the spectrum, there's he made a couple of really wonderful, nice little comedies. One that I like in particular is Song for a Bride, which was made in '88, it was. And it's a great ensemble piece with a lot of the Toho regulars, as well as a couple of comedic actors that were very famous in Japan at that time. It's a very, nice, small, heartwarming film. Very much, I think, sort of like, maybe 40s and 50s Hollywood comedies. They just have that very nice, upbeat quality about them.
And he was so skilled at kind of jumping from one extreme to another. Song for a Bride is a very upbeat, bright, funny, heartwarming kind of film. And his next film was The H-Man, which is downbeat, depressing, lurid, racy even. So it was quite versatile. Another one that I would throw in, and I would like to say this, we're hopeful. One of the reasons our book covers his whole career isn't just that, the primary reason was we wanted to know what made him tick as a filmmaker. And we felt the only way to really do that was to look at him as a filmmaker rather than as a maker of monster movies. And so we went on this journey of exploration and investigation, and we were able to locate all of his films, 40 plus films, except for two. One of them was a documentary that he made around 1950 that seems to be completely lost. There does not appear to be any surviving elements of that particular film. And then he made an independent film. He actually took a break from Toho without telling them in the late mid-50s and made an independent film with basically a student crew. And that was a little drama called Night School, like an hour-long drama, like a secondary feature. And that was distributed through Daiei, I believe, but we could never find that. We knew there was a print circulating around Japan. It actually had played at a film festival in 2009, and we were trying to track it down. Could not do so, and then we turned in the manuscript and find out that that film was coming out on DVD like a few months later. So it's out there now. I actually still haven't seen it.
Now you have something for the next edition.
Well, yeah, the DVD is sitting at the house, and I still haven't. But another one, there are many films we found that were quite lovely and would be deserving of some sort of a release here, like maybe through Filmstruck and the Criterion Collection. Because one of the things that's exciting about that is that they're exposing us to not only films by the auteurs and the acknowledged award-winning films of yesterday and today, but they also are starting, because maybe they're acquiring packages that include kind of off-the-radar films, but they've already distributed a number of mainstream program pictures from Japan at that time period. But I think it's not likely that, hopeful that maybe a couple of Honda's pictures will be included. I think his first film, The Blue Pearl from 1951, is a wonderful film. And as Ed was talking about, Honda loved documentary, and especially in his early films would incorporate documentary techniques and tropes, and that one has really overt documentary style sequences, but they work very well with the film because it's set in a pearl diving village on the Japanese coast. The story involves the way of life there being disrupted by the arrival of a young teacher from Tokyo. And so it's this clash of rural or rustic and modern and old and new values.
We've referred, or you've referred to, the constraints that were put on Honda's career. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that. Obviously, when the Godzilla and the science fiction films started in the late 50s, they were downbeat, they were reflecting a time and a period, the threat of nuclear apocalypse and so And obviously, when we get into the 60s, they go to color, they go to widescreen, they turn into fantasies, and instead of being afraid of Godzilla and King Kong versus Godzilla, there's a scene where the little kid is telling his mother, I don't want to evacuate, I want to stay and see Godzilla.
Right.
He's obviously not frightening anymore. Could you talk about, well, you know, was he chafing at this? What was he doing? You know, within the parameters he was given, we got to make these happy, fun Godzilla movies that appeal to moms and kids and so forth. What could he do? What was he doing? What was he trying to do? What did he achieve in some of those, you know, later films that are more fantasy, fun?
Well, you asked if he was chafing about the way Godzilla was being treated at that time. I think the perfect story to illustrate that is, you know, there's a scene in Monster Zero where Godzilla and Rodan vanquish King Ghidorah. Godzilla is this jumping dance. And during the 1991, when Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah was released in Japan, there was a TV special about it, and they had, you know, brought Honda on to interview about it. And they showed that particular scene, and then after the scene is over, they cut back to Honda, and he's sitting there with his arms crossed and a really, really, you know, the look that could kill on his face. And you could tell he just despised that. This is not what I think Godzilla. He was very upset, and you know, it's not. And I think, you know, we point this out in the book. I think it's somewhat speculation, but it's not surprising that after that film, Monster Zero, he didn't direct Godzilla. He kind of stepped away from that. And, you know, whether was that really the studio's decision to try and take the series in a different direction, or he just had enough of the way they had treated, you know, the character that he made so special. I think that there's some merit to that. We never found anything that he'd ever say, and I don't think he would ever say anything so directly. He's not that type of person, but I think it's a speculation that, you know, does have some merit to it. And you know, after that point, the only pictures that he started doing for that were science fiction were basically the ones, the international pictures where the foreign investors were actually asking for him to be part of it because his name had value.
And just to add to that, last night we showed Mothra. And Mothra is really, even before Godzilla started doing the jig, Mothra is really kind of one of the big turning points in this genre. And it was made deliberately to make a break away from the type of picture that Godzilla or Rodan or even the H-Man was. It was a deliberate attempt to make a family-friendly mass market picture, and that's why it incorporates for the first time in the genre, the Japanese genre, things like fantasy elements and beautiful music, and you know, it's this hybrid. My son and I were, when he was watching Godzilla tonight, he said that it has the exact same plot as Mothra. Well, it's really, Mothra has the exact same steps in it as Godzilla. You know, the ships get irradiated by the nuclear test, and then they find the survivors and go through an expedition there. There's a lot of the same steps, but Mothra's a completely different kind of picture. It's a sunny and bright picture with a happy ending. It's the first picture in the genre with a kid. The kid is one of the main characters, and you know all the funny bits with the mouths. It has comedy. It is deliberate. It is one of the main stars is a comedian. It has you know, the villain is this arch villain, very arch character. It's almost cartoony, and it has this wonderful happy ending where the monster for the first time is allowed to live. And the monster is really the good guy in the story, and that was a very, very successful experiment. It was one of the top 10 grossing pictures that year at a time when the Japanese film industry was booming. So there were a lot of pictures making a lot of money, and this was one of the top grossers. So that had a big effect on the direction of the genre and on Honda's career, because he was the one who made it. And then a couple of years later, you have something like King Kong versus Godzilla, which you talked about, which was an enormous hit. That was an out-and-out comedy as well. It was actually another hybrid of genres. It was a hybrid of the Japanese giant monster picture, and it has a lot of elements from Salad-Man comedy in it, including some of the actors who were famous for that genre. So these things tended to push or you know, steer the boat in a certain direction. Maybe not all at once. It's a gradual type of evolution. They would still make something like Mothra versus Godzilla or Godzilla versus the Thing, which is a more straight-ahead giant, and it's interesting to see how Godzilla's character kind of, has this sort of, he has this personality disorder where in one movie he's mean, and another one he's clowning around with King Kong. But,
Manic depressive.
but then, you see this sort of, maybe it's not, constant, but it's gradual. And it's something like Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, the monsters are talking, and then they come together, there's a mediator, Mothra, that they come together to fight the enemy. So there was this sort of slow but steady and irreversible push to make Godzilla and the other monsters more humanistic or humanized. And Honda was uncomfortable with that. And you asked about what he really wanted to do. There was actually a period, actually two periods, but one more extended than the other, in the early 60s, shortly after he turned 50 years old, when he consciously took a break from filmmaking to basically explore some of the ideas that he'd been working on and that he really wanted to develop. There were a couple of stories that he'd been kicking around after the war, one of which had to do with the ghost of a dead Japanese soldier that wanders around. And that, I can't say for sure, but it seems like a version of that, or that idea, and coupled with a dream that haunted him all of his life about the war, and inevitably or eventually would creep into Kurosawa's dreams in the tunnel sequence. It seems to have had some very direct influence on that. But he had a number of ideas that he took off time and tried to develop, but the movie business had changed so much by that point that there wasn't really any room for the type of smaller pictures that he wanted to do. And inevitably, or ultimately, he came back kind of with a vengeance, with a renewed enthusiasm for directing. And the second half of the 60s has some of the most memorable pictures of his career. There were a lot of obstacles that he had to overcome, and we go into some of those in the book, mostly having to do with the involvement of and interference by American producers and actors, and these pictures largely became co-productions, and that meant that the American studios that were production companies that were all had a say, which kind of interfered with the way Honda worked sometimes. And I find that conflict very fascinating, all the things that he had to deal with. But you asked earlier why we wanted to write a book about it. I mean, there are a lot of reasons, but one of them is that this is someone who's left us with a remarkable body of work. I mean, we're still talking about a lot of his films. It's been more than 60 years since Godzilla. And yet, he's never, up until now, rarely if ever been talked about as a filmmaker. It's just like the name attached to War of the Gargantuas. But yet, we saw and we recognized for a long time that there were themes running through and ideas, some of them very powerful, running through this body of work. And we just thought it was time to dive into these films and see what makes them work and what makes them tick.
Okay, I want to get to Kurosawa in a minute, but before you mentioned Godzilla's J. And that put a thought in my head, which is, I've read a lot about how Honda and Eiji Tsuburaya, the special effects man on these films, worked very closely in pre-production to make sure that the live action and the effects would integrate, that it would seem all like one movie. Yet, Tsuburaya is really the man responsible for the jig and the talking monster and so on. Did they really get along that well? Did in any of your research interviews, did you ever find like Han wanted to punch him, or at least tell him?
No, that was
please
totally,
stop.
that's totally outside of his character. Honda was the kind of guy that was looking for a way to get along, and it's probably Eiji Tsuburaya was actually well known as somebody who was very difficult to get along with other directors. I mean, there's a great story that we heard from Tsuburaya's cameraman Hirakawa about how one time, that Kurosawa and Tsuburaya had never gotten along. But there was one time, I think it was Throne of Blood, that for the moving forest scene, that Kurosawa actually asked the special effects crew to film something. And of course, most people thought, "Oh, this will never work." But without getting deep into that story, the basic idea was that Tsuburaya was a very difficult man to work with because he was very strong-minded and he had his idea of how he wanted to do things. Honda was really basically the only director at Toho who could get along with him and work very well with him. And the two were almost kind of finish the other person's sentence. And they were kind of like that in their work together. But at the same time, you would think that, okay, they must be really good buddies and they get along really well, but actually outside of the studio, they hardly associated with each other. They were basically, professional colleagues, and that was pretty much where it ended. You wouldn't have thought that, but that was true. And now what happened in this particular case with the Shie dance, I think that was, and it's the same thing that happened with King Kong versus Godzilla, because Tsuburaya was the one pushing the comic angle of the monsters fighting, whereas Honda, as we point out in our book, had some very deep reservations about that. He wasn't really on board with that particular thing. But that was the direction that the studio wanted to go, and reluctantly he went along with it.
Well, and we should point out that it really, the force driving the comedy in these films was really the studio more than anything. In the script for King Kong versus Godzilla, there are notes, like studio notes, that say, in the margins of where the monsters are fighting, to make it as funny as possible. So Honda and Tsuburaya worked extremely well. One of the stories that we heard time and again was that one of the reasons Tsuburaya had so much trouble with other directors is because they thought special effects were a joke, and they didn't really take it as a serious art form or a serious craft. Whereas Honda did. He had a great amount of respect for what Tsuburaya did and what he did. But make no mistake, Honda had the final cut, and the great thing about their relationship was because Honda showed Tsuburaya this respect, then Tsuburaya would essentially shoot it the way, shoot various things that you talk about the way that the live action and the effects had to work together. Sometimes Tsuburaya would shoot things multiple ways to give Honda options. And they were very responsive to one another in that regard.
Okay, so moving on to Kurosawa, as your book does, if you're fans of these films, if you're fans of Honda, you hear stories people talk about. He was associate director. Is that the credit they give him on a couple of later Kurosawa films? But people, fans, tend to credit him with more than just assisting. He's not out doing second unit shots or something. But I haven't seen a lot of this stuff sourced or really authenticated in a way. There's this assumption like he was a co-director or he was having a huge influence on these, dreams and what there were little episodes of it for his work. I mean, in one there's a bit with, radiation causing mutation and so forth, and you really look at that and think, okay, yeah, that's like a Honda thing.
About the Mount Fuji and
Yeah.
So
what did he do, and were you able to authenticate his contribution to it being more than just, Kurosawa's, I need this shot, get it for me,
he was, I would say, in a lot of these films, he was Kurosawa's eyes and ears. The relationship between these two was extremely close. Kurosawa trusted Honda wholly and completely. He wasn't a co-director. I know there's these, I don't know if urban legend is the right word, but I think people, because we're fans, some people want to project more of a role on the Honda maybe than he might have had. Like I've seen at one point, I think the IMDb, which is over time, I think it's gotten better, but it seemed like at one point you could email them a credit and they post it like, hey, I directed Citizen Kane. Okay, sure. But I think at one point they had Honda listed as the director of the tunnel sequence in Dreams, which isn't accurate. Kurosawa directed those films, but there were times when Kurosawa was incapacitated for a day or period, and he would send Honda to direct portions of the film, scenes or principal scenes. There was material for Kagemusha that Honda directed, for instance. And but not only that, what we found was that Honda acted as sort of a buffer for Kurosawa. Kurosawa having this volatile personality and temper, there were times when he would explode, and Honda would have to play peacemaker and smooth everything over on the set. They got back together. Their friendship goes back to the 1930s when they were assistant director trainees at Toho Studios, and they were went their separate ways. Honda, of course, was much more comfortable working as a studio director, and sometimes to his own detriment. And then Kurosawa was fiercely independent, sometimes to his own detriment. And by the time they reunited in the late 70s, both of them were basically, Honda was retired. Kurosawa was struggling to get financing for anything. And when he finally did, he asked Honda to basically come back and work with him and to be at his side. And again, sometimes Kurosawa's faculties, his vision and his hearing were not what they used to be, so sometimes he would ask Honda to see or hear things on his behalf. But he was there constantly, he had a great deal of influence, and he was a good counselor. It's more than an assistant director, but I think one of the reasons his title changes so much on this film is it's really hard to put a finger on exactly what he was.
You were going to follow up?
Yeah, and one of the things that Honda was very good at, having been in the military and having been an officer in the military, he was very good at controlling large crowds, getting people to do things. And that was one of the things that Kurosawa relied on for very extensively. And you have these big sweeping battle scenes in films like Mushin and Ran, and most of that was what he relied on Honda to take care of that and control things, get these big masses of soldiers and people doing the kind of things that soldiers would do and moving in ways that they wouldn't. So that's the kind of work that especially he was grateful to have Honda on hand for.
Okay, so I guess we should probably wrap this up and move on to H-band, but we've been getting a little serious, maybe a little more fun. Let's pick one of his films, a non-Godzilla film, a science fiction film that you would recommend to people. What else did he do that you think is totally awesome? Not Godzilla, but in science fiction.
Well, if you're talking about science fiction, then it's an easy choice for me. I go with The Mysterians. I think it's one of the most colorful and exciting films that Honda made. Just a lot of action and interesting science fiction concept. It's a simplified version of the War of the Worlds, and it very very nicely projects Honda's view of what humanity can accomplish when they all come together to against basically against a common foe.
One of the films that I wish we could have shown this weekend, but it's currently not available.